Hello, fellow gamers and enthusiasts. Welcome to the Fat Man GM's view on this, that, and the other thing. Gaming, all things gaming related. One of the subjects that I've been looking at lately is, amongst other people, is these. I'm spotlighting this game book or this module or this or that, and hey, that's a great idea. And I thought, you know what? Hey, I'm going to get my 2 cents worth in there too. So I go and I look at my own shelf and I say, just because it's 25, 30 years old doesn't make it any less valid or useful today to any game system for any GM or any player who wants to have this as part of their shelf. And I can tell you, I've had hours of enjoyment of just reading the material of these various books. They sit on the shelf, and for all intents and purposes, they look about as new as they did the day I bought them. There might be a little bit of Cheeto dust in them here and there, and some Dorito stuff, and occasional smudge where I sneeze. But what are you going to do? They are used, but they're great. Now, this is another piece of the Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition AD&D 2.0. All right, I used to have the 1.0. And tell my mother made me burn that stuff when I was 14. But that's a story for another day. Anyhow, one good piece of toolbox equipment for your shelf, for your game systems, whatever, is the arms and equipment guide. I don't know of any game system that don't have a variant or a version or several variant versions of this book. And it's almost a necessity. You can go in and you can pull your rule book, your main core book, if you will, and it's going to have a list of basic equipment, basic weapons, basic armors, and things like this. But what they don't do is go into any great length and detail or descriptions, and rightly so, because you're dealing with a core book. The concept there is to get you the bulk of the rules you need to function and play the game, not give you a whole slew of fluff. That's where these secondary books are for, and then a wonderful way for the corporations to cash in. Now, like I said before, this was produced by TSR probably in the late 80s, early 90s. I want to say late 80s. I'm not going to go look in the book and tell you for sure, but I have a whole set of these. They come in blue, green, and brown. They each cover a specific topic or character race or whatever. The main thing here is, even though it is considered 2.0 and is way outdated by a lot of your guys' mindset, it doesn't change the fact that it's still a valid piece of equipment. And this is what I've been noticing. I went back and I've been rereading through some of my stuff. Now, some of these things have sat on my shelf for 2 decades, easily 2 decades, and never used them. On the other hand, this is one of the books that I have used quite a bit because it gives me basic information and it opens up the eyes of players when it comes to looking at different stuff from a different angle. A sword is a sword is a sword, except it's not really. And if you know what I'm talking about, you know that there are scores of swords, and there's specialized swords, and there's general swords, and some are better for certain tasks than others. Well, you're not going to find that in your core book. Where you're going to find that's in your equipment guide, arms and equipment guide, your armory book, whatever you want to call it. The level that they go to, well, that depends on the creators and the current version of the game system. Like I said, this one here, like all D&D books, got some great artwork in it and the great descriptions. We go into, things like why you shouldn't sleep in a full suit of full plate armor 24/7. Why you gain fatigue points for doing that if your GM makes you apply that stuff. What's the difference between Drow chainmail and Elven chainmail? We don't think that. What about leather? I've had a couple of players come up to me, well, I need to get some Barting for my steed. And we go look in the core book and there's a little bit of rules on it, but not a lot of great. I pull this book out and it only got pages on it. And that's kind of what the book's for, to add the extra level of extra layer, if you will. Now, as a GM, you want to know what happens when somebody cuts the bridle string in a battle or the girth on the saddle. What happens to the player? What kind of roll should you make? If you're not familiar with what that piece of tack is, and that's TACK. I grew up with horses and stuff, so I'm quite familiar with what happens if the girth breaks. I've ended up on my butt more than once because of it. Or what about what happens if the horse throws a shoe? You know what? I have very rarely ever encountered a GM that tossed that in, but I have, and it's one of my favorite little ones. You know, an uber fail, you know, the mounted combat, which is also something that's fairly rare. Most players and GMs I've noticed usually park the animal is just transport. They don't actually deal with animal combat or mounted combat very often. On the other hand, if the campaign is and you're out there rolling around and the encounter happens while you're riding your animals, we're using those rules or you're dismounting. Well, and there's penalties for dismounting, and that's of course up to you. But I've had a player roll fail, and it says equipment failure. Well, what kind of equipment does your horse have? Horseshoes is one, assuming that you put them on there. I mean, it's just nice to have those rules. And as for the weapons and stuff, well, pretty much everybody can sit there and tell you that a club is a club, a sword's a sword, and, crossbow's a crossbow. And I don't need to know a whole lot about information and things like that. On the other hand, we get into some very unique weapons and stuff that we don't see a lot of use as the gamer, and players and gamers, game masters both tend to shy away from these things. The horseman's flail and the harpoon, the javelin. What's the difference between a throwing axe and a cutting axe? Here's one that comes up oddly enough more frequently than in with new players than any other one I can think of. What's the difference between a dagger and a knife? Well, what is the difference between a dagger and a knife? Do we have a modern day version of a dagger? And I'd have to say that, yeah. Look at a big Bowie knife, one of them big brush fighter cutter types that you see Rambo run around with. That is a dagger, or a very small short sword, depending on how you want to look at it. As opposed to a knife. Knife is one of those smaller, finer, weapons that you can conceal easier than you can a dagger. May not do as much damage, but they're more of a utility item than an actual weapon. But how often does it come up? More frequently than a lot of people think. You don't pay attention to that sort of stuff. I pay attention to some pretty odd stuff sometimes. Another one, and this is one of the reasons I got the book, was because it came to deal with pole arms. Pole arms are a very complicated set of weapons as far as I'm concerned. Majority of your player characters are never going to pick up a Bill Goshi or Gruesome or however you want to call it, Lutheran's hammer, a Ranseur. You're not going to pick one of those things up and carry it around and use it in a battle unless they're part of a formation, because that's not what the weapons were not really meant. A lot of these weapons were not meant for individuals in individualized combat. They were the pike, for example, 15, 20-foot long pike. The only way you get any real good use out of that is if you've got 50 of your friends all with the same weapon, working in lockstep formation, and keeping in mind that there's a big disadvantage of wielding an unwieldy weapon, and there's a lot of penalties for it, especially when you get into close quarters. They're all useless. As an individual, come on, really? You're gonna lug that 15-foot long pike around? You're nuts. Try taking that down into a dungeon and see how many negative modifiers I throw at you. Done it. I've done it. Stuff like quarter staves, short staves, bow sticks. One of my favorite unconventional weapons, the whip. Another section of this book that I enjoyed, and because you don't get the level of description and artwork that you do, or that in the equipment that the core books and the player handbooks and stuff, where they talk about basic stuff like your healer kit and clothing items. And I know the trend over the decades has been to minimize that. Back when they first started, they had a little bit wider range of clothing options, and now it's just you buy an outfit for this or you buy an outfit for that. Well, that's great, but if you're not from one of those hardcore Renaissance types, you don't really know what one of those things might look like. And here we go. This is what we're talking about. things like this, things like that. And there's a whole chapter on the stuff, and it adds a lot of level of fluff, if you wish, to it, or a lot of individuality to your character descriptions. If you can actually sit there and say, I have a hood and I do this and I have that, and I use slopes instead of shoes, and if you don't even know what that is, the book comes in and tells you. Really good edition. Like I said, I recommend it highly. Yeah, I'm sure you can find this thing in used bookstores or on the internet, fairly reasonably priced. Just because it says second edition doesn't mean that it's defunct. You 5e fanatics, keep this also in mind for your Pathfinder and other game system, financiados. These are source books. If you take away that, you just get this. And everything in here is valid in any game system you play. And I don't care if it's science fiction, science fantasy, war talk, battle, a tabletop board game. You can get some valuable information out of this stuff. The rules, the modifiers and stuff aren't that tough to adjust. Get yourself a pencil it in. Some of the stuff was dependent on the old DATCO, and a lot of it isn't. A lot of it could easily translate to the D20 system that's popular today. Just a little bit of modification. Something to keep in mind, something to consider.